We've been talking for a number of weeks prior to the new year about the Ten Commandments, and we're looking at the fifth commandment, honor your father and mother. And I hope to wrap that up before we went on the Christmas break and before I was going to be gone. Unfortunately, I wasn't quite able to do that because although we could have started this discussion a couple of weeks ago, I didn't feel like we would come anywhere close to finishing it, and I wasn't sure it was the kind of discussion I wanted to leave on a cliffhanger, so I thought we would sort of hold off and actually talk about it today, and hopefully get through it today and then move on to the next commandment. But as we look at the Ten Commandments, or we look at the commandment for children to honor their parents, one of the things we see, and we've talked about this a lot, is that this is an archetype for a larger scale concept, which is the importance that God's people are honoring and behaving appropriately towards authority. Because even the authorities that aren't always doing things the way we think they should do them, not even necessarily doing things the way God wants them done, God still says, these are things that I have instituted, or that I have allowed to be instituted, and so you need to honor those things. You need to treat those things with respect, and treat that authority with respect. So, wives being subject to husbands. God has set up a model of male spiritual leadership. We're not going to go into that in detail today, because that would be a whole separate study, and it would take a lot more than today. Husbands loving their wives. So there's a reciprocal relationship there, but there is still a clear sense of where the authority flows. Children being obedient to your parents, but fathers do not exasperate your children. So again, a reciprocal relationship, but a clear sense of where the authority begins. And then he goes and talks about slaves and says that you should serve your masters not just externally, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. And although he doesn't say it here, elsewhere Paul will talk in Philemon in particular about the importance of how masters treat their slaves. And so even there is a reciprocal relationship, even in what we would today view as a very unfair institution in the first place. The notion of slavery is one that is repugnant to us today, and for many good reasons, but nevertheless, that system did exist at the time, and because of that, Paul says you need to honor the authority that exists under that system. Now, in Hebrews, the Hebrew writer talks about the larger scale of authority, how we treat our rulers. And he says, obey your leaders and submit to them, for they keep watch over your souls as those who give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with grief, for this would be unprofitable to you. Now, last time we started this, I made the mistake of conflating this with another passage and thinking that this was talking about earthly authority, and it's not. What kind of authority is this passage talking about?
Eldership.
Church authority, elderships most particularly, but as we'll see here in a second, there's kind of a broader sense of authority in terms of age and wisdom in the church as well. And so in 1 Peter says, younger men likewise be subject to your elders, and all of you clothe yourselves with humility toward one another, for God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And elsewhere in Peter as well as in Paul's writings, he talks about younger women being respectful of and learning from older women. And so there is this idea that the elders, and not elderly, that's not necessarily what we're talking about here, but those who are older, those who have greater wisdom and greater experience, should take a leadership role or should be shown deference by those who are younger. Not because they're always right, not because they know everything, but because all things being equal, someone who has lived longer and lived reasonably well as they've lived is going to have some wisdom that somebody who hasn't lived as long may not. Some insight. And so there's a validity to what they do. There's a reason why when we choose elders or shepherds, we're not supposed to choose real young people. We're not supposed to choose new Christians, because the fear is that somebody who's young, somebody who's new, even if they know if they're good at what they do, they're going to get big heads, they're going to make mistakes, they're not going to have the judgment that they need to have that comes with experience. There are some things you just can't really get good at until you have experience. It doesn't matter how much you've learned. That was a lesson I had to learn through experience, ironically, as I got older. And even now I've come to understand more how little I do understand sometimes. So we get these different principles within the church. Then we look at the larger society, and that's where we start to get into some commands that we feel somewhat uncomfortable with sometimes. So in 1 Peter he says, Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as the one in authority, or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. Now this is an interesting phrase, first of all, because he says every human institution, not just pick and choose the ones you like. I don't know how many of you are free, the name suddenly escapes me. There's a group, they've been around for quite a long time now, and they call themselves constitutionalists sometimes. They have different names, but basically sovereign citizens. Thank you, that's the one I'm looking for. They believe that most of the authorities of the government don't apply to them. They're more than happy to use all of the services the government provides, to drive on the roads that were built by the government, and to take advantage of the various things that the government has built and has done, but they don't feel like they should have to pay taxes. They don't feel like they should be accountable to the government, that the courts have authority over them. This is an extreme version of what we see with some other people as well, but this particular concept is one that if you go and you look at Peter, it's pretty hard to support that concept from a Christian standpoint. So he says every human institution. Now, we know from other places that when it says every human institution and authority, that the one exception to that is when that authority is commanding you or trying to force you to do something that's contrary to what God wants. And so Christians defied the Roman government when it said worship Caesar. Christians defied the Roman or other governments, and Jews before them defied other governments when the governments told them to worship in ways that they weren't allowed to worship, or not to do things that they knew that they should do. So Christians met in secret despite the fact that the Romans had made Christianity illegal. So there is that one specific exception, and we've talked about this a little bit already. It's important to understand that exception, when we see it applied in the scriptures, we always see it applied in a situation where not doing whatever it is that the Christian or the child of God does would make them answerable to God's law. Not simply where something that society is doing is something that they object to, not because they have to partake in it, but because the society is doing it, and that therefore gives them license to do things illegal. We don't see, to use a modern example, we don't see Christians or using violence to prevent other people from doing things that they think are objectionable. Murdering an abortion clinic doctor, for example. You may be opposed to abortion, and I hope you are, but the idea of saying we shouldn't do this, and then extending that to therefore I'm going to kill people who do this, is going beyond God's law. So if the government were to say you have to have an abortion, and that's what was going on in China but it technically still does, sort of, but what's going on in China for a number of years, there you have a different situation because the government is ordering you to do something that is wrong. But simply the fact that you see evil around you does not justify going outside the bounds of the law to sort of prevent that evil in some way. So when we talk about this, there is that one exception. But beyond that exception, in general, as Christians, we find ourselves being expected by God to do what those in authority tell us to do, to honor and submit to authority, even if we don't always agree with what it decides to do, or the kind of things that it's doing, and even if it seems to be a very godless thing, because he says that you're doing it for the Lord's sake. You're not doing it because of how great that person is or what they're doing. You're doing it because of the Lord's sake. So he continues and says, "For such is the will of God, that by doing right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. Act as free men, and do not use your freedom as a covering for evil, but use it as bondslaves of God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king." The comment that he makes there about acting as free men is an important thing to understand in the context that he's writing in, because remember that both Paul and to a lesser extent Peter have been teaching about the importance of recognizing that Christians are free from the law of Moses, that they are not under the obligation of those laws. And as a result of that, what you had was people, particularly ones that Paul had dealt with, who had used that as an excuse for licentiousness or for disobedience to civil authorities. Hey, I'm free. If I'm not under the old law, the law of Moses, surely I can't be bound by human laws, right? I can't be bound by human morality and the expectations of my society, so I'm going to do whatever I want to. And Peter, as well as Paul, are going to say, no, that's not the way to think about that. That's not what's going on here. This isn't about you being able to do whatever you want to. This is about you being free from the law of Moses, from those regulations, in order, as Peter says, to now be slaves of God, slaves of righteousness, not by doing ticky-tack little things to meet all the obligations of the old law, but by acting in righteousness. And Peter says one aspect of righteousness is that we submit ourselves to human institutions. We're going to get into this a little bit more when we look at Paul's comments in Romans, but this is kind of the beginning of this discussion that kind of lays out this idea of what God wants. Now, yes, Steve.
Well, I was saying, we can't just take this verse and say that's the only place in the Bible that really talks about this concept. So even Jesus said, render unto Caesar what Caesar's, In other words, if we're going to be Christians, we can't be combative with every single thing out there, because then they're going to go, well, what kind of peace do you have? So there's another verse somewhere that says, be at peace with all men, and there's pray for those that despitefully use you and things. So yes, we don't agree with what goes on in governments and all of that. And even Peter says the point of the government is to punish the evildoers and praise those who do right. But even that doesn't even occur in 100%.
We don't always see that, absolutely.
And so it just says, humble yourself and live as God would like you to live.
Jerry.
I guess, I've looked at free men, not saying you're wrong, I've just looked at it as a different use of free. Elsewhere, Paul says that he is going to choose he can make a choice between eating meat or not eating meat. He's free to make that choice. And that is how I have always looked at that word in this verse, is that we have a choice to be obedient, to recognize authority or not. We're free to do that. But do not use that freedom as a covering for evil. So I just never have thought of it in your context.
Well, I think you and I are actually kind of saying the same thing, which is that just because we are free from human regulation created by a religious system doesn't necessarily mean that we should feel like we can do whatever we want to, in the sense that it's okay to do whatever we want to. You're right. Paul says, whoa, that's exciting. Paul says, I can eat meat or not eat meat. And he's particularly talking in that context about meat that he doesn't know whether it's been sacrificed to idols or not. But his ultimate point there is, but if it's going to cause my brother to stumble, I'm not going to do it. Not because I'm not allowed to, not because I don't have the authority to, but because to do that, well, now I've broken it. Okay, this is getting exciting. I'm going to get another one before I hand this to you, or else something bad will happen. But so there is this idea that that Christian freedom and our relationship with God supersedes all human regulations and ties and everything else. Jesus talks about that. But at the same time, Paul and Peter both are in agreement that just because that's true doesn't mean that the best choice or the right choice is to just do whatever you want to. Because if it's damaging to other people, if it is damaging to the reputation of Christianity, if it is contrary to God's will for us, we are still, expected to do what God wants us to do, not what we want to do, when those things collide. Linda.
Having spent 42 years in education and watched the evolution of what we were supposed to teach or support, and certainly we don't have to discriminate, but when they tell you that you have to do certain things that are not like LGBT movement and what to teach and that kind of thing, it's a real challenge. I mean, I think today we have to decide what we can do professionally. Mm-hmm. I think starting out for younger people, they can choose that, but for people who've been in the system a long time and are ready to retire and are suspect or losing their jobs because they won't submit to that erroneous teaching, sinful teaching.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think when we get into some of those areas, it gets more complicated. I had a conversation many, many years ago now when I was a youth minister working in Tucson. I had a conversation with some of the teens who were talking about, they wanted to One of them wanted to go, he's going to play in the NBA. And I said, well, first of all, you're too short. And I've seen you jump, and it's just not going to happen. But let me step beyond that for a second and just talk about this a little bit. What is the life of an NBA player like? And they said, well, you get all this money, and you have all these fans and all these women, and it sounds fantastic. And I'm like, hey, but let's think about that from a Christian perspective. What does that look like from a Christian perspective when you are constantly surrounded by people who want to do whatever you want to do, and who are going to tell you that everything that you want to do is the right thing? What impact does that have on you as a person? I said, also, think about the schedule of an NBA player. You spend about a third of the year traveling away from home without the ability to kind of have ties. You may have to move at a moment's notice from one place to another. How often do you think you could go and meet with the brethren at church when you are in the middle of a season? How's that going to work? You know? And I started going through and talking about it, and I said the reality is that there are certain careers that it is very difficult to maintain your Christian beliefs and your Christian faith and your Christian ideals if you are engaging in those things. Not because you're a bad person, but because the environment is extremely contradictory to what you want to do. And I said, so professional athletes are one of those. I would say that people who are entertainers on a mass scale are a similar one. But I said, beyond that, though, those are easy ones to look at, because we look at some of the things those people do, and we're like, oh, well, clearly there's some problems with this. But then think about some of the other things. Think about the military, for example. A career military person. Think about what you're surrounded by when you're in the military, what you may be having to do, where you may be shipped around and moved. How much are you really going to have an opportunity to form relationships with brethren? How much are you going to actually be able to do the kinds of things that help you to maintain a healthy Christian relationship? Now, I wouldn't tell any of them, don't join the military. But I would say, count the cost of what it's going to mean to join the military. You know, and so some of those things are independent of what you're talking about, the pressures to teach and do things that are contrary to what we believe. But when we talk about career choices, and when we talk about the things that we are choosing to do, the reality is that when your job involves doing something, you cannot, in good conscience, I think, take a job that you know is going to ask you to do something you don't want to do if you're not willing to do it. And I would say that irrespective of whether it's a religious question or something else. You know, when you have someone who takes a job that involves, you know, say working a certain number of hours a week, and they know that they're going to spend at least some of that time just blowing it off and not doing their work, that's disingenuous and it's dishonest to do that. And by the same token, just because something, a particular job, involves something that you believe is morally wrong, to me does not excuse you from saying, okay, or does not permit you to say, okay, well, I'm going to take this job, but because this is morally wrong, I'm just not going to do that part of it. Or I'm going to get the job and then I'm going to challenge the legitimacy of doing that. Now, that second one, in our country, that's actually legal and that's okay to do, and you can do that. You can challenge the legitimacy of a job requiring you to do something like that. And we see kind of a mixed bag of success with that kind of litigation these days. It was really trending against Christianity for a while. The Supreme Court's and the change of the makeup of the Supreme Court has altered that trajectory, at least for a time being anyway, to increasingly favor Christianity. But the area where it gets particularly complicated is when you're already in the position when the rules change. I think, for example, of the woman who was the she was the clerk of the court who objected to certifying gay marriages, gay marriage licenses. Now, I have a different perspective on that than she does, just in general. I feel like you're not marrying them, you're not taking part in that. Your job is simply to certify that they meet the requirements of the law. There you are actually engaging in discriminatory behavior if you won't do your job. But that's my perspective, and you may not share it. And I don't think you're wrong for feeling that way. That's just how I see it as a lawyer. But the problem for her was the rules changed while she was in the job. She had been elected. She had been in the position for a year or more after having been there for many previous terms. And now she's being told you have to do this. And so it seems unfair to us on the face of it to say, well, you need to resign. If you can't do that, then you need to resign. Because she's been there for all that time. But if we look at it from the standpoint of, okay, so what if someone believes something that we disagree with? What if someone believes, for example, from a religious standpoint, that marriages between blacks and whites should be illegal? If they're in that job and the law changed, which it did many more years ago, and said, no, you can't discriminate on that basis, should they be able to go to the Supreme Court and say, hey, I should keep my job, I shouldn't have to do this? Well, suddenly, I'm guessing most of us in here don't feel quite the same way about that. But they believe that honestly as a matter of their religion. So where things start to get sticky, and this is why this discussion is an entire class and maybe a couple of them, is because where things start to get sticky is when we step away from what we believe to what somebody else believes. And are we going to apply the rules the same because of belief, or does it have to be right according to me for me to apply the rules? Because one of those things is fair and even, and one of those things is a very dangerous way to think. And so it's tricky when we start to think in those terms and when we start to permit everyone who legitimately believes something to define their own view of what they should have to do in their job. That can be dangerous, Linda.
Well, if we're supposed to be light and imitate Christ, and we confront families, parents, young children, and children on a regular basis, and we're opposed to the transgender LGBT movement, it isn't that simple.
No, it's not. That's my point.
If we don't imitate Christ, if we don't shine the light, we're having the opposite effect.
That's true.
It puts us in conflict, and I think it's a very pervasive problem. I have a lot of friends who are teachers, and they're just devastated.
Well, we're not. It's interesting because the Payson School District is quite conservative, and so we're not put in a position of having to. I imagine it is. And there are definitely school districts in other places in Arizona that are much more liberal as well. We're not, as teachers, required to, well, I guess it would depend maybe to some extent on the field that you're in, but in my particular field, I have not encountered a situation where I'm being told you have to teach this or you have to say this. The one that they talk about, although we have never really been given specific mandates on this, is the use of pronouns and some of those kinds of things. We don't really have any specific mandates on that, but that is unusual that we're kind of in that situation, and it comes from being in one of the more conservative communities and counties in Arizona. So that's a good thing, obviously, from my perspective, because it solves a lot of the problem for me. But I'm not unaware of the problem as a result of that. And so the problem, in one sense, is, okay, so here I have an opportunity to teach what's right. But to do that, I have to do what my job tells me I'm not allowed to do. And that's a very thorny situation, because on the one hand, if I don't do what my job tells me to do, then why should I be doing that job?
Exactly.
You know, and on the other hand, if I don't do the job, then now I don't have that opportunity to teach what's right. So there's definitely a controversy there. And again, right now, the state of litigation in America suggests that we may have more freedom to disregard some of those rules than might have been the case 5 years ago, and that might be the case 10 years from now. It just depends on the court and how it views some of these different things. But as Christians, I think we would be wise to, when we are in positions that have the potential to encounter those kinds of things, we would be wise to have considered what we think is the best thing to do before the situation arises. This is a generalized truth. It is always a mistake to leave unresolved questions of things that you are likely to encounter. Now, if it's, what happens if a meteor falls on and hits across the street, and the situation, we're devastated. Let's plan for that. No, let's not. That's probably not a good use of our time. But what happens if somebody breaks into your house at night? That's probably something you should have at least some kind of a general plan for, because there's a real possibility that might happen. And so if you're in a job like teacher or soldier or whatever it is, and there's real possibilities that those things are going to be presented, then good sense says have a plan. Decide what you think is the right thing to do. And I will say this, I I'm not going to get up here and tell you what the right thing is to do in those situations, because I think that is a matter of personal judgment. I don't think there's a definitively right answer to those questions, because there is such complexity to it. Personally, I will tell you that with few exceptions, my approach would probably be initially to try to use, whether it was the administrative process or the legal process, to continue to do things the way that I wanted to. But ultimately, if that doesn't work, then it's necessary to step down. You can't continue to do a job when what you want to do and what your employer are willing to let you do are constantly at odds. You just can't. To me, again, that's how I see it. But I think that that's a matter of judgment. So we start to run into these complexities. And here's the thing you need to understand. We tend to get real dramatic about this. Oh, our society is falling apart. Oh, we are being made to do so many things and accept so many things. But here's the thing. We live in what is still, and has been historically, one of, if not the freest society ever to exist on this planet. In all of human history, however long you want to count that, whether it's from the point that we started organizing governments back in Egypt, 7 or 8 or 9 or 10,000 years ago, or if you want to go as far back as humans started, making little tribes or whatever. But in all of human history, there has never been a society and nation that is more free than we are, with arguably the exception of maybe a couple of smaller European countries that have found themselves in those positions. I think of Norway, for example. They have massive oil wealth, and because of that, as a society, they can kind of do whatever they want to and make their own decisions. So they have a level of freedom that may exceed even ours. But from the standpoint of a large-scale society, we are free in ways that most of the rest of the world today can't even imagine, much less throughout most of human history. And as much as we might think the situation is bad, the simple fact is that in no position that I'm aware of in terms of how we interact with our governments or with our employers, are we ever at risk of them saying, do what we're telling you to do or we're going to kill you. And fundamentally, that's the difference between us and most other societies historically. The Christians in Rome didn't face the choice of, oh, you might get fired if you won't stop talking about Jesus. The Christians in Rome faced the choice of stop talking about Jesus or get fed to the lions in the arena. And so when we get so outraged, I understand where that's coming from, because we don't necessarily have a clear, an alternative view of how the world has looked. But when Americans get so outraged, and American Christians, about how the society is turning against them and how all these things are going on, it's important for us to remember that the right to have our own religion is established in our Constitution, and that it's been honored for the most part in our favor for 200 plus years of our society. And it's only as it's starting to turn away from being in our favor that we are now really freaking out about it. And we're still nowhere near the societies throughout history that have made it a matter of criminal offense or a matter of life or death, whether you did what God wanted you to do. And if we keep that in perspective, not to say, okay, so we can just do whatever the government tells us to, we should just do it. Not to say that, but to recognize that the burden that we're being asked to bear is not this huge and unreasonable and horrible thing that God has laid upon us by the godless society we live in, but rather that we still live in the freest society in the world, especially when it comes to religion. Maybe it helps us to have a little bit better humor about the situation, a little bit better perspective on what we're dealing with, and a little bit more grace in how we respond to those situations. So, Ian, go ahead.
One thing that kind of stands out to me as far as kind of being dramatic about things is not the LGBT whatever.
They keep adding additional letters.
Well, eventually they're going to include all of us.
Right.
So, but not that that's not an evil movement, because I think it is. I think it's horrible and what it stands for, but it's not the only sin out there, and it's not any worse than any of the other ones out there.
Right.
First of all, so yes, I think that it does need to be stood up against, but I think that we could probably start looping it in with the rest of the sins of the world.
Yeah.
And as far as again being a little bit dramatic about things, we look at examples of of characters in the Bible, specifically the New Testament with the apostles, they were just fat and happy being fishermen, and no one was really casting an eye towards them. But as soon as they started working for Christ and started fulfilling that's when it got good. That's when they started getting persecuted. So when we feel like the world's turning against us, maybe we're doing something.
I know. That's an important perspective to have as well, is that when the world is saying, you're a problem because of your belief in God, you're like, cool.
Yeah.
Yes!
Yeah.
Finally! That's what the apostles actually said when they got kicked out, or the Sanhedrin punished them and threw them out. They praised God for being counted worthy to suffer disgrace for the name. So, yeah, that's absolutely right. We should be not, and here again, it's really important, because Paul says this, don't confuse, if you're acting bad and the government does bad things to you, don't think that's good. That's not good. That's you being a bad citizen and getting punished rightfully. But when you're doing what God wants and people are upset with you, then you should be proud of them. So understand the distinction. Linda, I think you had something else to add maybe. I wasn't sure, so.
It's just, it's so frustrating in the sense that as a Christian, you want to be the example, you want to shine your light. At the same time, when you see these things, this evolution of things, I think we still have a responsibility to be active.
Yeah.
And I mean,
one of the things, and
we can't just sit back and do nothing.
right. One of the things that I have observed, and I've only been doing this for a few years. I did it as a student or as a teaching assistant at Westwood down in the valley for a couple of years, shortly before I came up here. And then, of course, I've worked as a substitute and now as a teacher for about 4 years now, 3.5 years now. One of the things that I have observed, and I don't think it's a universal truth, but I think it is a consistently recurring truth, is that very often the students who are identifying as LGBTQ, in particular those 4 categories, are marginalized students. They are students who don't have a lot of friends. They are students who have been typically picked on most of their life. They are students who are profoundly disconnected from the rest of the students for various reasons. And some people will argue, well, that's because of them being those things or exhibiting those behaviors, and when they're younger, people not really be willing to accept that. And that may be an element of it, but I don't think that's primarily the case. I think most people, with the rare exception that we see on the news of parents who are helping a 5-year-old transition or something like that, most of the time you start to see these issues popping up in junior high and high school. That's when you start to really see it, because for one thing, kids that are younger than that rarely have a clear gender identity anyway, other than just, girls are icky or boys are dirty. Or to the extent that they do, it's generally something that their parents have shown them. You wear a dress because you're a girl, you wear pants because you're a boy, you like Barbie because you're a girl. And it's not that the kids don't tend to go along with it, it's just that the parents assume that that's kind of how things are. So it's not until students or kids start to develop a larger sense of self than just the family's definition of it, that they really start to think about these things in great detail most of the time. And what I observed is that most of them who tend to go in that direction have been marginalized and do not feel like they have attachments, and in many cases have households that may not be abusive, but where they're definitely not valued and given attention and seen as being important and relevant. I say this to say this. I believe that in many cases, when you see students who are trying to embrace these alternative behaviors, these alternative sexualities and all these kinds of things, that what they're really doing is they're trying to find connection by identifying with something that is at least a clear enough group that they will be accepted by somebody. And I think that what's really happening, and this should not surprise us, is that we have a whole lot of young people who are desperately trying to find real, godly love because they've never experienced it. And they know that they want this thing, they probably can't identify it by word or by a specific description, but they know that they're supposed to have in their life people who love them regardless of who they are and regardless of the fact that they're young, and who are concerned about what's best for them regardless of how it impacts the other person. They know that that's how it's supposed to be, even if they don't understand that in a conscious way, on a subconscious level. I think all of us understand that. And when they don't have that, they go looking for it however they can find it. And some students go looking for it by achievement. Some students go looking for it by doing bad things to create chaos and havoc in the hopes that somebody will pay attention to them. And I think more and more, as it has become acceptable within our society, have gone this route of identifying sexually with, or gender-wise, misidentifying, I should say, in order to find a way to access love. Because they know that if they identify as lesbian or gay or queer or transsexual, that there is a group at school that will welcome them in simply because they have identified in those terms, which on one level is a really weird way to do things, but nevertheless, they see that. And so they know that they're going to be welcomed in by that group, even if they don't even necessarily believe it, they're going to be welcomed in. And so I think when your brain is as flexible as teenagers are anyway, it's really easy to convince yourself that you're like that, because what it does for you is it makes you feel fulfilled, and that's what most of us are actually looking for when it comes to our relationships with other people and our sexuality and those kinds of things. And so I'm not trying to legitimize this. What I'm trying to say to you is that in many cases, I think that the failure, the mistake that we are making is spending our time trying to tell them how wrong they are to think that. And we would be better served recognizing what's really going on and providing them with what they really need. And then I think many of them would move away from that. And so, I can see this in a lot of adults that I know who are identifying with those groups as well. The degree to which they identify based on a sense of need to be part of something more than any sort of really identifiable reality in their life. And so I think as Christians, our first responsibility is to shine the light of Christ, but not in the sense of let me illuminate everything that's wrong with you. Our first obligation is to show people that they're loved and to show them kindness, and then to use the relationships that we have to show them the truth of what God wants them to be. And I think that's where a lot of these teachers' movements that are opposed to the LGBTQ agenda are kind of missing a critical element that would help them to be more than what they are right now, and would help us as a society maybe to Christians, I should say, in our society, to be seen as less of a threat and more of a solution that's a non-conventional solution. So
And the thing is that we forget that God is on the throne. He is in charge. He is in control. And that before even this LP whatever came, it's that God was kicked out of society, of schools, of government, of everything. Only if something bad happens, then they say, where is God? Exactly where you put him. But the thing is, God said, I don't know how, in which verse, that He gives you over to your wishes. And we all get the wishes that we put God out, and now bad things happen.
yes, and that's not a new thing.
True. Christians did not stand up. They were not quiet when God was taken out of everything. They were just quiet and let it happen. There was no voice, no nothing.
Well, and like you said, that's not a new thing. We can see this happen throughout history. You know, we can, it's also important to recognize we are not, by any means, the first society. I mean Western society in this context, not simply America. We are not the first society to struggle with a descent into carnal sin. The Israelites did it on more than one occasion. The Greeks did it, the Romans did it, and in every case, there was that gradual descent into corruption, both morally and politically and societally, and in every case, eventually there was the judgment where that society was replaced by a different society. That has always happened, and with the exception of the Jews, and be careful because I'm not even talking about America here, with the exception of the Jews, There has never been a nation that God said, I am making you my special nation. I'm making you my special people. Christians are God's special people, but that's not a nation. It's not a nation in the sense that we use the term normally. I'm talking about borders, king, all that. There's never been a nation except the Jews, the Israelites, who God said, you are my special people. You as a nation are my special, most favored nation over everybody else. And God even says, and I let your stuff go on way longer than I would have let anybody else do it, because you were my special people. But in every other case, God says, I raise nations up for reasons. When they fulfill those reasons, if they won't honor me, I break them down again. And I think the lesson out of that for us, and we're stepping aside from the whole authority thing, or maybe we're looking at the bigger authority here, the lesson for us is that America is no different. We have a lot of people who are Christians, and we historically have a lot of people who are Christians, but that doesn't make America a Christian nation, God's chosen nation, any more than Britain was, or Rome was, or whoever else it was. Again, only the Israelites were ever given that distinction as a physical, corporeal nation. And so, if that's true, and it is, then it means that America was raised up for specific purposes as well. And if we fulfilled those purposes, and we're no longer honoring God, then we're in trouble. Or for that matter, even if we haven't fulfilled those purposes, God has shown a willingness to move on for people who won't get it done. So we need to be humble enough to recognize that just because we have traditionally been a nation of Christians, and that we have traditionally been a ridiculously powerful nation for how young we are, that doesn't mean it lasts forever. And that ultimately the authorities that God sets up, He does judge and He does overthrow if they don't do what He wants. And so in the meantime, while we're submitting ourselves to human authorities are also still subject to God's authority, and there is still consequences associated with that. And this is the most disturbing aspect of all of this. On more than one occasion in the Scriptures, we see God basically stimulating people towards making bad choices. And I don't want to try to get into how exactly that looks, because that sounds like God tempting people and stuff like that. But we see God, certainly in Romans, the passage Sylvia mentioned, we see God handing people over to their bad decisions and to their evils. And if we start to see that in our society, that almost always means that God is done and moving on. And so it should alarm us the degree to which that is happening in our society, because it very much suggests that God is wrapping up with our society. And that's a scary thing, except that we know that even though our society might get wrapped up and things might get bad from a physical standpoint, we are still on a spiritual rock that is unmoved by all of that. And so there's no need to fear, but there is a need to be cognizant of what's going on. Steve?
Just prior to this verse here, Peter's talking about us as living stones. He's talking about us as a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. But you're right, it doesn't not mean North America or the United States. He's talking about personally, us, His chosen people, the ones that He has chosen. In verse 5 it says, as living stones are being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God. So no matter what happens with the government or our culture or our constitution, we still are the chosen race of God, and we need to live as living stones of that institution.
Exactly. And we are not, the brilliance of Christianity, and of course God designed it, so it's like I'm passing judgment as a fly on the wisdom of what a man does, but God designed Christianity, and one of the things that you see with Christianity that is so distinctive from Judaism is it doesn't require borders, it doesn't require buildings, it doesn't require sacrifices, it doesn't require any physical, temporal thing to be able to function. It is not limited by borders and by rules and laws of man. You don't need that for Christianity to operate. Judaism needed that. Modern day Jews are not following the law of Moses correctly. They can't, because they're supposed to sacrifice, they're supposed to go to Jerusalem, they're supposed to do things they're just not allowed to do. So they cannot meet the requirements of the law of Moses any more than the Jews who were in captivity could. But the difference with the Jews in captivity is that they did come back and get to reinstitute those things for a period of time, and there's just not much to suggest that that's ever going to happen again. But regardless, it's not working the way it's supposed to. Christianity can work wherever it is, because ultimately it's about the people. It's about the church, which is a spiritual entity, and it's about what we do and how we think and what we believe, and not what anybody else says the rules are. And so from the standpoint of authority, God is our authority. But how that makes us react in our society is, in general, it should be a good thing. We shouldn't be in conflict, except where the society simply wants us to do things God won't let us do. Okay, we're going to stop today. We're going to finish this up next week. Hopefully, I keep saying that, but we'll see.